Long before Hungary existed as a kingdom, before Europe even knew where to place the people who would later be called Magyars, their story was already moving, quietly, relentlessly across the vast open spaces of Eurasia. To understand the origins of the Hungarians, you have to forget modern borders completely. There was no Hungary, no Europe as we know it, no fixed identity carved in stone. There were only tribes, movement, survival, and memory carried through bloodlines and songs. The ancestors of the Hungarians did not begin their story in the Carpathian Basin. Their roots stretch far east, into the shadowy borderlands between Europe and Asia, where cultures blended, clashed, and disappeared without leaving written records. Most scholars trace the earliest origins of the Hungarians to the Ural Mountains region, a vast and harsh land that today lies within Russia. Thousands of years ago, this region was home to Finno-Ugric-speaking peoples, hunter-gatherers who lived off forests, rivers, and seasonal migration. The Hungarian language still carries deep genetic links to this group, which includes Finnish and Estonian, even though modern Hungarians look and live nothing like them. Language is the strongest surviving clue from this era, because material culture fades, but words endure. Linguistics shows that the ancestors of Hungarians once lived alongside other Uralic peoples, sharing vocabulary related to nature, hunting, fishing, and early forms of social structure. Life in this early phase was brutal and simple. These communities depended on rivers for transport and food, forests for shelter, and animals for survival. There was no agriculture as we understand it today. Identity wasn't national, it was tribal and familial. Power came from leadership, experience, and survival skills, not territory. Over centuries, climate changes and population pressure began pushing groups outward. Some moved north and west, others south and east. The ancestors of the Hungarians slowly drifted away from their Uralic cousins, beginning a separation that would define their future. At some point, these early Magyar ancestors entered the forest steppe zone, a transitional land between dense forests and open grasslands. This was a turning point. Here, they encountered new peoples, new animals, and new ways of life. The steppe was not just land, it was a system. It favored mobility, horses, and warfare. It punished weakness and rewarded adaptability. The Magyars did not conquer this environment, they learned from it. They adopted horse-based movement, animal husbandry, and elements of nomadic warfare that would later make them feared across Europe. As they moved southward, they came into contact with Iranian-speaking steppe peoples, such as the Scythians and later the Sarmatians. These interactions mattered. From them, the Magyars absorbed concepts of mounted combat, social hierarchy, and perhaps early forms of tribal confederation. This wasn't cultural replacement, it was layering. The Hungarian identity was already becoming a hybrid, shaped by borrowing what worked and discarding what didn't. Survival demanded flexibility. By the 1st centuries AD, the Magyar ancestors were no longer isolated forest people. They were part of the wider steppe world that stretched from Central Asia to Eastern Europe. This world produced some of history's most powerful nomadic forces, the Huns, Avars, Turks, and later the Mongols. The Magyars were not yet dominant, but they were learning, they were watching, they were adapting. One of the most important influences during this phase came from Turkic peoples. Linguistic evidence shows that Hungarian absorbed hundreds of Turkic loanwords related to warfare, leadership, animals, and social organization. This tells us something critical. The Magyars were not slaves or passive neighbors. They were politically and militarily engaged with Turkic groups, possibly as allies, subordinates, or members of steppe confederations. These relationships reshaped their society. Tribal leadership became more centralized, military organization became more disciplined. The horse was no longer just transport, it was a weapon. This period also begins to explain a mystery that confuses many people today. Why Hungarians look European but speak a language unrelated to their neighbors? The answer lies here. The Magyars absorbed people as much as ideas. As they moved westward, they intermarried, defeated groups, and adopted outsiders into their tribes. Ethnicity on the steppe was fluid. Loyalty mattered more than blood purity. Over time, the Magyar tribal core remained linguistically Finno-Ugric, but genetically and culturally mixed. By the 6th and 7th centuries, the ancestors of the Hungarians were living somewhere east of the Carpathians, likely in regions north of the Black Sea. This area was a crossroads of empires. Byzantines watched from the south, Slavs spread across Eastern Europe, Turkic Khaganates rose and fell. The Magyars were no longer just surviving, they were positioning themselves. They had become skilled horsemen, experienced raiders, and organized tribes capable of large-scale movement. Crucially, they did not yet see themselves as Hungarians. Identity was still tribal, based on clan names, leaders, and shared enemies. But the foundation was set. Language, military skill, adaptability, and steppe experience had fused into something new. The Magyars were becoming a people capable of carving out a homeland, but they hadn't found it yet. Everything so far was preparation. What came next would push them violently into European history, whether Europe was ready or not. By the time the Magyars entered the historical radar of Europe, they were no longer an obscure tribal group drifting through the steppe. They had become a militarized people, shaped by centuries of movement, pressure, and survival among stronger powers. This phase of their story unfolds in the volatile zone north of the Black Sea, a region where empires collided and smaller peoples were either absorbed or destroyed. The Magyars survived because they learned when to fight, when to submit, and when to move. During the 7th and 8th centuries, the dominant force in the region was the Khazar Khaganate, a powerful Turkic state controlling trade routes between Asia and Europe. The Magyars fell under Khazar influence, and this relationship profoundly shaped their political structure. Evidence suggests that the Magyars were not enslaved, but incorporated as a subject or allied people within the Khazar sphere. This mattered. Under Khazar rule, the Magyars learned advanced forms of governance, taxation, diplomacy, and military coordination. The Khazars operated a dual kingship system, one sacred ruler, one military ruler, and traces of this system later appear among the Magyars themselves. This period marks the first time we can speak of the Magyars as an organized tribal confederation rather than scattered clans. Sources describe them as being divided into multiple tribes, traditionally 7 core Magyar tribes, later joined by others. These tribes shared language and culture, but were united primarily by military interest and leadership. Unity on the steppe was always practical, not ideological. Confederations formed for survival and dissolved when no longer useful. The Magyars, however, maintained cohesion longer than most. It was also during this time that the Magyars absorbed the Kabar tribes, a rebellious faction that broke away from the Khazars. The Kabars were experienced fighters and politically dangerous, exactly the kind of people the Magyars needed. Their inclusion strengthened the Confederation militarily and pushed it toward independence, but it also made the Magyars enemies of the Khazars, destabilizing their position in the region. Geographically, the Magyars lived in a territory later remembered in Hungarian tradition as Levedia, named after a leader called Levedi. Whether Levedi was a real historical figure or symbolic ancestor is debated, but the name represents a transitional homeland, never fully secure, always temporary. Life here revolved around herding, raiding, and seasonal movement. The Magyars were not farmers yet. They were still the people of the horse, the bow, and the open land. Their military reputation grew rapidly. Byzantine sources describe them as fierce, disciplined, and terrifyingly mobile.
The Magyar warrior fought primarily as a mounted archer, using speed and deception rather than brute force. Feigned retreats, sudden ambushes, and relentless pursuit became their signature tactics. These were not wild raiders, they were trained professionals of steppe warfare. Europe would learn this lesson the hard way later. Pressure on the Magyars came from all directions. To the east, Khazar power weakened. To the north and west, Slavic populations expanded. To the south, the Byzantine Empire manipulated alliances to protect its borders. Most dangerously, from the east came a new force, the Pechenegs, another nomadic people driven westward by steppe politics beyond the Magyars' control. The Pechenegs were aggressive, numerous, and hungry for land. This is where the Magyar story turns from adaptation to crisis. The Pechenegs attacked Magyar territory repeatedly, destabilizing their settlements and killing any illusion of permanence. The Magyars could fight, but they could not win a war of annihilation against an endless steppe enemy. The old strategy of surviving between empires no longer worked. Staying was extinction. So the Magyars made the decision that defines their history. They chose migration over submission. This was not a single march, but a calculated, desperate movement of an entire people, warriors, families, herds, leaders, and memory westward into unknown territory. They passed through a region known as Ethelköz, a land between rivers, which again served only as a temporary refuge. Even here they were not safe. Pecheneg attacks continued. The steppe was closing behind them. At the same time, opportunity appeared. Beyond the Carpathian Mountains lay a basin rich in rivers, pasture, and defensible terrain, the Carpathian Basin. It had been occupied before by Celts, Romans, Huns, Avars, and Slavs, but no power held it firmly. Empires rose and fell there, leaving space, ruins, and weakened populations. For a people skilled in rapid conquest and settlement, it was a prize waiting to be taken. Leadership was critical now. This is when figures like Almos and later his son Árpád emerge from legend into history. Almos represented sacred authority. Árpád represented military command. Whether by tradition or necessity, power consolidated around Árpád. The Magyar Confederation needed a single decisive leader to guide it through the most dangerous transition in its existence. By the late 9th century, the Magyars stood at the edge of Europe, not as refugees, but as a sharpened weapon forged by centuries of pressure. They were no longer running, they were aiming. What followed would shake medieval Europe to its core.
When the Magyars crossed the Carpathian Mountains at the end of the 9th century, they were not entering an empty land, nor were they blindly wandering into Europe. This was a deliberate conquest, calculated with the instincts of a people who had survived on the edge of extinction more than once. The Carpathian Basin was not just fertile and defensible, it was strategically perfect. Rivers acted as natural highways, mountains formed barriers against eastern threats, grasslands supported horses and herds. For the Magyars, it was the first land that truly fit everything they had become. The event known in Hungarian history as the Honfoglalás, the taking of the homeland, was not a single battle or year. It was a process stretching roughly from 895 to 907, involving waves of settlement, conflict, alliance, and consolidation. Under the leadership of Árpád, the Magyar tribes moved in force. They did not face a united enemy. The region was fragmented, ruled by weak Slavic principalities, remnants of the great Moravian state, and scattered local elites. No power could stop a fast-moving, highly organized mounted force. The Magyars used the same tactics perfected on the steppe, light cavalry, archery, surprise attacks, but now applied them against settled populations unused to such warfare. Fortifications that relied on slow infantry defense failed. Armies built for set-piece battles collapsed under constant harassment. Fear became a weapon as powerful as the bow.
News of Magyar raids spread faster than they could be stopped. By 907, the conquest was effectively complete. A defining moment came with the defeat of a large East Frankish army at the Battle of Pressburg. This victory secured Magyar control of the basin and permanently altered the balance of power in Central Europe. The Magyars were no longer migrants, they were rulers of a land, and they defended it with lethal efficiency. What followed shocked Europe. For the next half-century, the Magyars launched raids deep into Western Europe, reaching as far as Italy, Burgundy, and even the Iberian Peninsula. To medieval chroniclers, they appeared almost supernatural, appearing suddenly, striking without warning, vanishing before a response could form. Churches rang alarm bells, monasteries recorded prayers begging for deliverance from the arrows of the Hungarians. But the truth most simplified histories ignore, these raids were not mindless brutality, they were strategic. The Magyars exploited political divisions, hired themselves as mercenaries, and punished enemies who threatened their borders. Raiding was not chaos, it was policy. It brought wealth, intelligence, and deterrence. It also delayed direct retaliation while the Magyars strengthened their hold on the Carpathian Basin. Inside the basin, change was already happening. Nomads cannot rule farmland forever without adapting. Gradually, the Magyars began to settle. Seasonal movement remained, but permanent villages formed. Agriculture expanded. Local Slavic populations were not wiped out, they were absorbed. This fusion shaped the genetic and cultural foundation of modern Hungary. Magyar language dominated, but customs, tools, and farming methods blended. Leadership also evolved. Árpád's dynasty consolidated power, and authority shifted from purely military leadership towards territorial rule. Law, tribute, and administration began to replace constant warfare. This transition was uneasy. The Magyar way of life had been forged in motion and combat. Settlement brought stability, but also vulnerability. That vulnerability was exposed in 955 at the Battle of Lechfeld. Facing a united German force under Otto I, the Magyars were decisively defeated. Their tactics failed against a prepared enemy. This was not just a military loss, it was a psychological one. The era of unchecked raiding ended. Europe learned how to fight them. The Magyars learned they could no longer survive as steppe raiders alone. This defeat forced a reckoning. Continue raiding and face destruction, or transform and survive. The Magyars chose transformation. Over the next decades, their leaders began shifting towards Christian Europe. Diplomacy replaced terror, conversion replaced isolation. The old gods faded as political realities set in. The steppe world that had created the Magyars was dying. The future belonged to states, not tribes. By the end of the 9th century, the Magyars stood at a crossroads. They had conquered a homeland and terrified a continent, but conquest alone was not enough. To endure, they would have to become something entirely new. That transformation would produce a kingdom and permanently redefine what it meant to be Hungarian.
After Lechfeld, the Magyars understood a brutal truth. The old steppe way of life could no longer protect them. Europe had adapted. Fortresses strengthened. Armies learned discipline. Surprise alone was no longer enough. If the Magyars stayed what they were, they would eventually be crushed between stronger Christian states. Survival now required a transformation more dangerous than war, the abandonment of their past. This transition did not happen overnight, and it was not peaceful. Inside Magyar society, there was resistance. The old warrior elite had built its power on raiding, pagan belief, and mobility. Settlement, Christianity, and centralized authority threatened everything they knew. But geography left no alternatives. The Carpathian Basin locked the Magyars into Europe whether they liked it or not. Power slowly consolidated under the Árpád dynasty, descendants of the conqueror Árpád. Among them emerged a leader who understood reality with ruthless clarity.
Géza, the Grand Prince of the Magyars in the late 10th century. Géza was not idealistic or gentle. He ruled through force, executions, and intimidation. Pagan rivals were eliminated. Rebellious tribal leaders were crushed. His goal was simple: unity at any cost. Géza also recognized that Christianity was not just a religion, it was a political weapon. Conversion meant legitimacy. It meant alliances, recognition, and protection. He accepted Christian missionaries, allowed churches to be built, and formed ties with the Holy Roman Empire. Yet Géza himself remained spiritually ambiguous, using Christianity as strategy, not faith. The true break with the past came through his son, Stephen. Stephen was raised Christian, educated in Western political thought, and married into European royalty. When Géza died, Stephen claimed leadership, but he was immediately challenged by pagan factions led by his relative Kopani, who represented the old tribal order. This was more than a power struggle, it was a civil war between two versions of Hungary, one looking backward to the steppe, the other forward to Europe. Stephen won decisively. Kopani was defeated, executed, and his body publicly displayed, a brutal message that the old ways were finished. From this moment on, resistance collapsed. Pagan shrines were destroyed, Christian institutions expanded. Hungary crossed a point of no return. In 1000 AD, Stephen was crowned King of Hungary, recognized by the Pope. This was not symbolic, it legally inserted Hungary into Christian Europe as a sovereign kingdom. Borders were defined, counties were organized, laws were written. Churches became centers of power and administration. The tribal confederation was dead. The Hungarian state was born. Stephen ruled with iron discipline. Conversion was enforced, resistance was punished, but stability followed. Hungary stopped being a target and became a player. Instead of raids, it negotiated. Instead of terror, it projected authority. Instead of wandering, it endured. Culturally, the transformation was massive. Nomadic traditions faded, but they did not vanish. Military skill remained. Horse culture survived in modified form. Hungarian identity became layered, steppe roots beneath a European structure. This duality would define Hungary for centuries. By the time Stephen died in 1038, Hungary was no longer an anomaly. It was a kingdom with laws, borders, and a future. But that future would be tested again and again by invasions, internal conflict, and the collapse of empires around it. The Magyars had survived extinction, migration, conquest, and reinvention. One final question remained. Could this new Hungary survive the storms of medieval Europe? That answer comes next.
The Kingdom of Hungary did not emerge into a calm and orderly Europe. It was born into a continent defined by constant pressure, empires expanding, faith reshaping politics, and borders written in blood rather than ink. Stephen's work created a state, but it did not guarantee permanence. What followed was the true test, whether a people forged in movement and war could survive centuries of external assault without losing themselves. Almost immediately after Stephen's death, Hungary faced internal instability. Succession disputes weakened royal authority, and pagan uprisings briefly resurfaced. This exposed a deep truth. Conversion had been fast, but belief had been uneven. Christianity was now law, but memory of the old gods still lived in the countryside. Hungary did not erase its past, it buried it under necessity. Over time, church structures, monasteries, and education completed what force had started. Hungary became Christian not just politically, but socially. Externally, Hungary's location made it both valuable and vulnerable. It sat between East and West, Latin Christianity and Orthodox influence, settled Europe and nomadic frontiers. This position shaped its destiny. Hungary became a buffer state, absorbing shocks that might otherwise have devastated Western Europe. This role brought prestige, but also endless warfare. Through the 11th and 12th centuries, Hungary stabilized and expanded. Kings strengthened institutions, invited settlers from the west, and developed towns. Yet the old martial spirit never disappeared. Hungarian armies remained respected, fast, and disciplined. The memory of steppe warfare lingered in tactics, horsemanship, and social values. Hungary did not forget how to fight, it refined it. Then came a catastrophe no one could adapt away. In 1241, the Mongols invaded Europe, and Hungary stood directly in their path. The Mongols were not like earlier nomads. They were faster, more numerous, and strategically superior. Hungarian forces were annihilated at the Battle of Mohi. Towns burned, populations were massacred. The kingdom nearly ceased to exist. If survival defined Hungarian history before, this was the ultimate trial. But Hungary survived, again. After the Mongols withdrew, Hungary rebuilt with grim realism. Stone castles replaced wooden defenses, cities were fortified, military reforms accelerated. The lesson was learned at an unbearable cost. Hungary adapted not out of pride but necessity. Survival was not heroic, it was mandatory. Centuries later, another empire rose from the east, the Ottomans. Once more, Hungary became the front line. Once more, it absorbed the first blows. The Battle of Mohács in 1526 shattered the medieval kingdom, dividing Hungary between Ottoman occupation, Habsburg rule, and semi-independent regions. Yet even in fragmentation, Hungarian identity endured. Language, custom, and memory held when sovereignty failed. This is the final truth of Hungarian origins. The Magyars were never defined by purity, isolation, or uninterrupted power. They were defined by adaptation under pressure. From the forests of the Urals to the plains of the Carpathian Basin, from pagan tribes to a Christian kingdom, from nomads to nation, every stage required change without surrender. Modern Hungary exists because its ancestors learned when to fight, when to move, and when to transform. They did not cling blindly to the past, nor did they abandon it completely. They carried it forward, reshaped by necessity. That is why Hungary speaks a language unlike its neighbors, why its history is marked by survival rather than domination, why its identity feels older than its borders. The Magyars did not arrive in Europe to disappear. They arrived to endure.